With President Bola Ahmed Tinubu's declaration that fuel subsidy was gone in his inaugural speech, the price of fuel rose, leaving long queues, higher transportation costs, and the attendant effects on the cost of living in Africa's largest economy. Nigeria has grappled with subsidies since the 1970s and through several administrations. The price of petrol is considered a major driver of the cost of living as it is used by all, including small businesses and many households. Given the unstable electricity supply, what was meant to serve as a cushion for global price pressures instead became a hydra-headed monster that has bled the country's coffers. As fuel subsidy is truly looking like a thing of the past in Africa's largest crude oil producer, conversations are shifting to the way forward. Joining me now is PwC's fiscal policy partner and Africa tax leader, Taiwo Oyedele, a friend of the House. Taiwo, it's always a pleasure to see you. Thank you so much for joining me on the conversation today.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tolu. Pleasure to be on your program.
So before we go forward, let's just go back a little bit. Petrol subsidy is not the only subsidy that Nigeria has had, and there are still several others in place. But it's also been the most controversial. So 13 years after diesel was deregulated, then we know kerosene subsidy was also removed in 2016. But why has this subsidy on PMS proved so highly inextractable? Why has it been so hard to get rid of this particular subsidy?
Yeah, good question. I think the simple answer is that Nigerians are, for very maybe difficult to explain reasons, they are fixated on petrol. And most times the reaction is not based on evidence or data. It's just the fear of something will go wrong and our life will become impossible, even though there's no data to support that. I do admit that removing subsidy in any form or shape, we have an implication. That's why it's a subsidy in the first place. It means that there will be cost of living will rise. It means that some people will need support, especially if they don't have alternatives or options as to what to do if you raise the price and they cannot afford it. But if you break it down, actually, the reality is that the most vulnerable Nigerians have very limited touch points with petrol. They live in rural areas, they trek, leggedies, they trek to work, to farm, to school. And then even in urban area, in Lagos, for example, Molue is powered by diesel. So then you find the poor people that are using kerosene are not getting any subsidy. So as a matter of fact, and based on some data, including the one that the World Bank will refer to, about 40%, bottom 40% of Nigerians consume less than 3-4% of the petrol. So I think it's the time, right time for it should have happened before now, but better late than never. But I do think that we need to move forward after removal of subsidy on petrol.
So when you talk about who actually has direct touch points with the subsidy for fuel as well as the numbers, then it begs the question, where are we getting these numbers when it comes to Nigeria's daily consumption? Because many people believe it's tied directly to the smuggling across borders that happens when Nigeria's petrol moves from here to our neighboring countries. Where do these figures come from? Because they seem to be in doubt since probably the past decade in terms of how much Nigerians are consuming when it comes to fuel on a daily basis.
Yes, the figures are significantly in doubt, particularly because government itself cannot even tell us authoritatively, the consumption that Nigerians consume on a daily basis. So you find all manners of numbers flowing around. NNPC will give you a different number than Nigeria Customs Service, than the NDPRA, the regulator. So somewhere around 66 million liters per day. Sometimes we had 98 million liters per day. During the height of COVID, when the price of crude oil in the international market went down so significantly, such that our pump price was even higher than market price, our consumption was around 33 million liters. So altogether, the reality is that the bulk of what we are paying in subsidy is going into corruption and some people just taking advantage of the country unduly. You will remember that when the subsidy on diesel was removed about 12-13 years ago, the consumption actually went down by 50%. And the increase in consumption of petrol was marginal. It wasn't like they even transferred their consumption from diesel to petrol. It was just that, the fraud disappeared because there was no incentive to smuggle anymore or commit any other forms of fraud. I expect the same thing will happen to petrol, maybe even more than 50% reduction in supposedly, high numbers of consumption currently being bandied around.
All right, so from consumption, let's talk about how much it costs the country. So Nigeria's budget has also seen an astronomical growth in subsidy that is tied to how much we've been giving. So the Nigerian National Petroleum Company Limited said we spent 4.39 trillion naira, about $9.7 billion on petrol subsidy last year. It's estimated we've spent over $30 billion on subsidy for the past 18 years. So Taiwo, I think in terms of also going by what makes the subsidy, sort of the equations and the figures that go into the subsidy. It's important we also have that. Where does the increase in how much the country spends on subsidy come from? Is it directly just tied to this international price of crude oil, global pressures, or also the implications of corruption in the subsidy regime?
It's a combination of factors, and I have to even say that we don't have the accurate number of the cost of subsidy. We've never been able to do that accurately as a country. So there are, several components to the subsidy. One is cost under recovery. In other words, if the landing cost of a liter of petrol is 400 and you sell it at 165, the difference is, cost under recovery. But in addition to that, there's also FX subsidy, because other people don't get foreign exchange at the official market rate, including people who import diesel. That's why diesel at a point was as high as 800, 900 naira. Even manufacturers don't get the FX at the official rate. So technically, allocating our FX for petrol importation and denying every other sector of that forex is a subsidy from foreign exchange. And then the other component is, government has been borrowing heavily. So when you deny government of the revenue across all levels, and then they have to borrow and they service it at double digits, you also have interest subsidy. So if you put the under recovery in terms of cost plus FX subsidy plus interest on the borrowing of government, you would easily be very close to between 7 to 8 trillion naira per annum, particularly in the past 1 to 2 years. So this is very huge and it's not sustainable, and definitely we cannot continue with it. In fact, the bigger aspect of this conversation is the fact that it is not a commodity that you can buy with naira. So because you need dollars to buy it, and if you run out of dollars, you can't print dollars because you're not the US government. And when you run out of dollars to be able to import petrol, then there will be rationing, there will be shortage, and the economic impact will be far worse than anything that you can imagine now as a result of the subsidy removal.
Okay, so I want to stick on this track, but I also want to ask a question because for Nigerians, the idea is subsidy is one of the reasons we haven't had infrastructure, we haven't had good roads, education is suffering, health is suffering, other critical sectors of the economy are also suffering. So plainly put, is subsidy really the reason we're having some of these issues in other important sectors? Because when we look at it, subsidy becomes this boogeyman in national budgetary conversations. Is that really the reason? Or is this also about public expenditure and the fact that governments and successive administrations have failed to efficiently manage Nigeria's resources and, of course, its budget?
I think the underlying factor is, inefficient management of public resources. But you can also attribute some of that to the, petrol subsidy. For example, if you even think about the fact that according to the National Assembly, we spent over 10 trillion naira maintaining and turning around refineries that did not refine anything over the past 10 to 12 years. And the governor of Nasarawa State was on record saying that that amount is even more than what Dangote has spent to build a refinery with about 150% of the capacity of the Nigerian 3-4 refineries combined. So extremely wasteful in the way we have managed that sector. So, but you can imagine if you didn't spend that 11 trillion naira on the refineries, and you didn't have to spend, average of whatever it is. Sometimes the NNPC will tell us 400 billion per month on subsidy. You clearly have a lot more that you could have channeled to infrastructure, human capital development, particularly, education and healthcare. So certainly you can attribute the lack of development, of the country to this subsidy regime.
To some of the suggestions, but I quickly want to sneak something in because this refineries, it's also almost like Nigerians believe the refineries working, whether at 50% or 60% capacity, would be a silver bullet. Is it the silver bullet we all seem to think it is, or it's just a way to reduce the burden?
This answer is very important because this question is a very important question. There's no evidence to show that if our refineries are working, then our subsidy problem will be reduced or eliminated. In fact, the opposite seems to be the case if you look at the data. And I'll tell you two major reasons for that. The first one is that the NNPC CEO also had said in one of his appearances before the lawmakers that in fact when we're refining, whatever limited product we're refining, they had to make the decision to shut down the refinery because the refineries were taking in product of, crude of say $100. And then when they are done refining, the value of what they refined is about $95, $97. So value was even being lost in the process of refining, just to give you an idea of how inefficient those refineries are. If you add on top of that the fact that we spent over 10 trillion trying to turn around and maintain this refinery, I can tell you therefore that if you produce any refined product, you are likely to end up with the most expensive per liter cost of production in the world for our refinery. So Nigeria, in my view, is even better off just giving those refineries away. So we stop bleeding the country of its limited resources. And thank God we have Dangote refinery coming on stream. You can also liberalize the sector. Let everybody import from anywhere they want to import from. So because today, the ex-refinery price or cost of 1 liter of petrol is around 70, 80 cents USD. So you have countries like Ghana also import refined products, and they have like 7 different taxes on petrol and diesel, and they still end up with just about $1.10, which if you convert to Nigerian naira using the official exchange rate, is even less than 500 naira.
All right, so let's go to solutions and, of course, the way forward. We've had numerous conversations on the fact that you believe that inadvertently Nigeria is taxing the poor. We're taxing more people into poverty, and even those who are already in poverty, we're unduly burdening them. So it has been suggested that instead of completely scrapping the subsidy, the government redesign the regime to be able to make sure it goes directly to the poorest Nigerians. But given the data you shared earlier, the touch points that the poorest Nigerians have with fuel subsidy, how would that even work? In terms of redirecting and redesigning, is there a way to direct any subsidy, any particular subsidy when it comes to this issue, directly to the poorest Nigerians?
Excellent question. So I think, at the heart of the question you just asked now is the need for data and evidence-based decision making. That's really lacking in Nigeria, significantly lacking, both in government and sometimes even in the private sector and the public in general. So for example, I would say to you that the most vulnerable people in villages, in rural areas, have limited to zero touch points with petrol. So their lives will not be impacted materially because you remove petrol subsidy. Many of them won't even know how much they sell the price of those products. So the poorest people that will be most impacted are the low-income earners in urban areas and towns. So imagine someone in Lagos who is earning 30, 40,000 naira per month and have to commit to work every day. So they spend a lot on transportation. They don't produce the food that they eat. They have to buy food, and then they have to pay rent. Their life can become almost impossible. So these are the category of vulnerable Nigerians that we have to target with our intervention. And those interventions could be by way of encouraging the employers to increase their wages. Government can do that for the public sector. And then you provide the framework or incentive for the private sector to be able to do that with some credit from government, and also exempt them from paying personal income tax on those minimum wages. In addition to that, you can then find a way to make sure that the sector is attractive to public transportation investment. The whole idea of asking government to go and do the investment and provide buses is not sustainable. But if you make it attractive, demand has now been created, and then supply will follow from the investors that, you go to some developed countries and you see a CEO of a big company that says, I have no car. They just get into public transportation and they are fine. That's also even good for the environment. I think in the medium to long term, this holds a lot of promise for Nigeria, and it will have significant benefit. And even just talking about data as well, so if you have a liter of petrol and you're driving a car, it takes you an average of 7 kilometers to exhaust that. So you know that the ride-sharing drivers have been protesting.
Yes.
Because their increase was just about 15 to 20%. But what I can tell you is that those apps are using data, and they've done their calculation and they've seen that this increase in fuel price because of subsidy removal only amounts to between 15 to 20% increase in fare. But they are looking for 200 to 300% increase. And I can give you just simple example. From the airport in Lagos to Ikoyi is about 28 kilometers. You need 1 liter to travel 7 kilometers, so which means you need 4 liters. So from about 200 naira per liter to around 500 naira per liter, you need an extra 1,200 naira to travel from the airport in Lagos to Ikoyi. So what they need to add to the fare is 1,200, not to increase the fare by 200, 300%. This is why the impact is bigger than it needs to be. But I'm very hopeful that over the next couple of weeks, the market would adjust all these overreactions.
And we've seen that a lot of people taking advantage. I have 2 quick questions I need to ask you before we wrap up this conversation. So let's look more. You've touched a little bit about what can be done for the most vulnerable to the removal of the subsidy. So President Tinubu has directed the National Economic Council to find ways to cushion the blow of the fuel subsidy removal. But it's more than palliatives. It's also more than $800 million of a loan from the World Bank. So to adequately cushion things in relation to the subsidy, there must be changes that are structural. So Taiwo, you talked about an increase in the minimum wage. Some have also mentioned subsidizing public transportation systems, not necessarily just putting buses out there for amounts of time, but structural reforms within Nigeria's economy, even tackling food prices, because there is a part of the rising cost of food that comes from the cost of PMS. So what are we looking at in terms of structural changes that can make this situation better for Nigerians?
Yes, indeed. So the direct impact of this fuel subsidy removal would appear first on transportation. And if you're looking at the impact, like I said already, based on data, this impact is between 15 to 20% increase in transport fare. Based on the NBS National Bureau of Statistics result survey, the average price per bus journey in Nigeria is around 550 naira. So you expect about 15 to 20% increase in that amount. Now, how much of your household income are you spending on transportation? It will range between 10 to 30%, depending on how much you earn and where you live compared to where you work. Overall, the impact on the cost of living for people will range between 2 to 6%, after the overreaction has really settled down. So what are the structural changes we need to make? So first, how can you make transportation affordable? The best way to do that is to make, public transportation of different forms and shapes, whether it's by road, whether it's by sea, and make them connected together. It's an integrated strategy for transportation that we have to do, both intracity and interstate and intercity as well. So, and I think this will be driven mostly by government policy, and the private sector would invest. Then the other impact you will find is on food. Now, today, the biggest challenge we have with food, especially if you compare the food inflation in rural areas with food inflation in urban areas, which is really accounted for, that difference is accounted for by transportation. The biggest problem is insecurity and bad roads and poor storage facilities for when you are transporting the goods. Sometimes you lose up to 40, 50% of the produce between farm and market. Now, imagine government can address that structurally. This increase in price of petrol would not even be noticed at all. In fact, many of the vehicles that we use in transporting these food items are powered by diesel, not petrol. So, and because we're also a little bit lucky that the price of, fuel product is coming down internationally, you can then even find a reduction in the price of diesel to offset whatever increase you have as a result of reduction of the subsidy on petrol, such that overall there should be negligible increase in inflation as a result of this.
All right, Taiwo, I'm going to sneak this in, and I need an answer in just 30 seconds because we've been looking at the long-term benefits. Short-term right now, it just seems to be a lot of pain for Nigerians. But in the medium to long-term, what do you think are the three biggest benefits, 30 seconds, of Nigeria removing the subsidy?
Yeah, no, the biggest one would be the stability of exchange rates. So I see Naira appreciating, which in itself will mean that the prices of goods and services will come down. Why it will appreciate is because you stop wasting about 16 billion importing fuel, half of which we can't account for, and you can channel that excess money to other meaningful sectors. Number two is that sector will contribute more to the economy of Nigeria because you find local refining, more investors will come in. We should even get to a point where we refine all our 2 million barrels per day if we can, and export those refined products rather than exporting crude oil. And thirdly, is the government revenue would increase substantially across federal, state, and local government. And hopefully, if we monitor them and they do the right thing, we can see that resulting in meaningful impact in economic development, infrastructure, and human capital development across Nigeria.
All right, Taiwo, I know it's the beginning of conversations, especially when we anticipate what the government will put forth as a plan in order to cushion the effects of the subsidy removal. So we look forward to talking to you another time. Thank you so much, Taiwo.
It's my pleasure, Tolu.
All right. And it's always a great conversation with Taiwo Oyedele, Fiscal Policy Partner and Africa Tax Leader for PwC Nigeria, looking at the way forward with the fuel subsidy removal. You're watching Business Edge. We have a timeout. We have international business news and more conversations after this.